This is the third Percival Everett book that I've read, and I think it might be the best one yet. Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel where today I'm reviewing Percival Everett's new novel, James. Everett is an American author and a highly prolific one. Since his debut in 1983 with Suda, he's written over 20 novels. He's been rewarded throughout his career, earning a dedicated fan base and something of a cult following. But in recent years, Percival appreciation has gone mainstream, and his last 3 novels have been recognised by some of literary fiction's most prestigious prizes. In 2021, his novel Telephone was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, losing out to Louise Erdrich's The Night Watchman. Then, in 2022, The Trees was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and in 2023, Dr. No was awarded the Penn Gene Stein Award, which rewards book-length works for originality, merit, and impact. Everett's 24th novel, James, is sure to continue that trend. If you've not heard about this one yet, it's a retelling of Mark Twain's late 19th century classic, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The original is told from the perspective of Huck, a young teenager in Missouri who fakes his own death and then goes on a number of adventures along the Mississippi River, some of which he shares with the runaway slave Jim as his companion. I was lucky enough to see Everett talk about this book as part of his press tour, and he mentioned that a common criticism of Huckleberry Finn is that Jim isn't quite fleshed out enough. But he also said that Mark Twain just wasn't equipped to be able to do that. He wasn't able to tell Jim's story. With 140 years of hindsight and learning, Everett decided to tackle this task at last, and my God, is it successful. The first question you might be thinking about when you are considering reading this book is whether you need to have read Huckleberry Finn first in order to dive into James. And I think the good news is that you don't really need to have read the original in order to get a lot out of this retelling. This is a powerful novel that stands on its own, diverting from Huck's story where it needs to, and also filling in the gaps when the two characters are apart for large parts of the original novel. I'm sure if you are familiar with Huckleberry Finn, there will be details that you appreciate more in this book, or retold moments that will stand in more startling contrast to how they were originally told. But although I would have liked to have read Twain first, I just didn't have the time, and so I watched a plot summary video instead. And I wouldn't even say that was essential. The two novels are in conversation, that's for sure, but this is a case where hearing just one side of that telephone call gives you more than enough to chew on. Everett's books tend to play with the absurd, using comedy as a way into serious and sometimes harrowing issues. I have loved both of the Percival Everett books that I've read until now, but rarely do I find myself recommending them without qualification. The Trees is a riotously funny mystery novel, but it purposefully subverts some of the expectations of that genre, and it has a frankly weird ending that I think will leave some readers unsatisfied. Erasure is a hilarious send-up of the publishing industry, but it contains a lot of literary theory that went over my head at least, and I think gives off some real big brain energy that might put some people off. And when it comes to playfulness with language, I don't think James is an exception in Everett's body of work. However, I think for the first time for me, he's hit this real sweet spot that's compelling and accessible while still being very literary, and I can't think of anyone I wouldn't recommend this book to. At the start of the novel, we're introduced to the central conceit of it, that while slaves use stereotypical slave language around their white masters, when they are talking between themselves alone, they just used standard English. Jim's abilities with language in particular are a little bit beyond the norm, on account of him teaching himself how to read and write surreptitiously in his master's library. Telling you about this concept is not a spoiler, it's in chapter 2, and all the chapters in this book are quite short. But it's very important and central to the entire novel as Jim learns that he is about to be sold and then goes on the run. This double life led by slaves starts off as a bit of a comedic device, as Jim is teaching his daughter how to use the correct, incorrect grammar. And there are these almost Toy Story-like moments where two slaves are talking to one another and then have to code switch very, very quickly when approached by a white person. They obviously don't drop to the ground like Woody and Buzz, but they do immediately have to start signifying their inferiority to make the white people feel safe, and therefore to make themselves safe. But this humour is a gateway into a much deeper theme about the power of language. For Jim and for Everett, reading is one of the most subversive things we can do. Nothing can mediate the space between the words on the page and what we do with them in our mind, at least until we're all wearing VR headsets 24/7 in some horrible dystopian future that I'm sure is on its way. Writing is the next most subversive thing we can do, and when Jim comes into possession of a pencil, and my gosh, you will never feel so emotional over a pencil, he feels the pressure to use it to write something meaningful and to bring himself into being, not as Jim, but as James. He's not starting from a blank page though, because until now, both metaphorically and literally, his story has been written for him by his white oppressors, or as he prefers to refer to them, his enemies. And this book is largely about the intersection of language and violence. Poor education and stereotypical language is used to justify the poor treatment, but it's an act of self-preservation because using standard English or using language to speak up for oneself would be used to justify much worse. That's how much of a threat language is, how meaningful it is in this world with these power dynamics. There are moments in the story where white characters are in mortal danger, but are more startled and preoccupied by the way a black person is talking to them than by the weapon being held against them. It's ultimately all about performance, about white people gleefully performing superiority, black people performing the role of a slave. And in one moment, Jim taking part in a completely absurd performance that is both funny and terrifying, but I won't spoil what that is. That point about being both funny and terrifying is actually really important in this novel, because although the book is humorous and the dialogue is quippy, it's also packed with the horrors of slavery. It doesn't shy away from the realities of it. It is dehumanizing and violent, and there is murder and rape. It is at times uncomfortable to read, and perhaps some of that has to do with the fact that the violence sits in such close proximity to the humour. But I think it's a testament to Everett's skill as an author that at no point did those two tones clash for me or one speak over the other. They really enhanced one another. I felt deeply emotionally affected by this story, but I also just enjoyed reading it and found it very funny. Moments that were amusing at first glance were troubling on second thought. I mean, there were plenty of moments that were just straight up horrifying too, but it's those layers in the storytelling that I think elevates this book and makes it something much more exquisite. The last thing to address is, where is Huck in all of this? Well, he's no longer centred, but he's not dispensed with or turned into a character that is deserving of our ire. Instead, his wide-eyed wanderlust serves as a counterpoint to Jim's weariness with the world around him and the brutality that he faces. Huck provides a way for the narrative to ask naive or innocent questions of its protagonist and be given challenging answers to them. Huck can't understand why Jim can call a river pretty but not a white woman, and his excitement about war and adventure butts up against the danger that Jim knows day to day. Everett has said that he sees Huck in the original as a representation of America reckoning with itself, and that seems more directly drawn out here, not least because the story has been moved 20 years later so that it butts up right against the start of the American Civil War. Everett has said he wanted to specifically draw out that theme and that it was easier to move the timeline of the novel than to move the war. The bond between Huck and Jim is really core to the story here, and there are some choices that Everett has made that I think may prove a little bit controversial with some readers, but which I loved. You'll notice that throughout this review, I've referred to the protagonist mostly as Jim rather than James. That's because this book is very much the story of how Jim becomes James. And to find out how that transformation unfolds, well, you'll just have to read it. Overall, this is an astounding, emotional, beautiful, humorous novel, and it's hard not to feel like I've just read a future Pulitzer Prize winner. I'll close out this review with a few very short clips of the event I went to recently where Percival Everett was interviewed about the release of the book. As ever, if you enjoyed this review, please do hit the like button because it really helps the channel out, and if you'd like to see more content from me, then hit subscribe. But until next time, toodles!